Welcome to my presentation on painting a portrait on aluminium. Every portrait has a story, and this one begins in Florence, where I spent 2 wonderful months in the spring of 2015 with the purpose of strengthening the classical foundations of my paintings. The experience proved deeper and better than I had anticipated. Everything about this romantic city is art. The intensive program was all about seeing.
If I need like a darker brown, if you have an area little pad that is really dark, basically you just get the black and I add a little bit of this instead of the other way around, because then you take all the black forever to make this like really dark.
We made copies of masterworks like the lithographs of Charles Borg and other earlier masterworks, this one in Sanguine by Michelangelo. And we also made copies in charcoal after masters like Andrea del Sarto and others. And we painted still lifes with a limited palette of just 3 colours and black and white. On days when we weren't at the studio, I loved to wander around the city just drawing. And during the almost 5 hours I spent drawing this view of Florence from the Piazzale Michelangelo, I became a bit of a minor tourist attraction, sitting there on a rock in my Panama hat. Everything was leading to drawing the human figure from life. And this long pose, which is done in charcoal, took place over 8 mornings at the studio. And this oil portrait of Matteo was painted directly from the model in 6 afternoons with no prior drawing. But sometimes a subject may not be readily available to sit for long sessions, as in the Academy, and I saw this woman in a shop in Florence and I was a little reluctant to approach her, but Sarah asked her on my behalf if her husband could draw her, and I was quite pleasantly surprised when she agreed. So I asked her to pose outside for several photographs, and back in my apartment I drew this portrait of her in charcoal. But now to the subject of this video itself. One day I spotted this man in a cafe beside the Duomo, and I was struck straight away by the graphic quality of those wonderful dreadlocks and his remarkable profile, and I regretted not asking him just then if I could draw him. And I couldn't get this image out of my mind, so I went back several times over the next month to the cafe and the surrounding area, hoping I would spot him again. And then, remarkably, one Sunday in a small English-speaking church we were at, Sarah said to me, "You're not going to believe this. Amos was sitting directly behind us." And so another opportunity arose to photograph him, posed as I'd first seen him. Florence was wonderful and I didn't want to leave, but I was glad to be back in Dublin with its wide streets and neoclassical buildings, and to my own comfortable studio looking across fields stretching away to the distant mountains, and to an opportunity to begin painting the man I'd seen in the cafe in Florence. For this painting I chose a sheet of aluminium composite panel, a rigid but relatively light surface. This brand I'm using here is called Sky Bond, but it's also known elsewhere as Dye Bond. So I first sanded it lightly and then coated it with 8 coats of acrylic gesso, and finally I sanded that too, and now I was ready to begin my painting. I began by covering the panel with an imprimatura, that is a diluted coat of oil paint, and here I'm using a mixture of Indian yellow, alizarin, crimson and olive green as used by Sean Cheetham from Los Angeles, and I darken the panel towards the edges with cobalt blue and red umber. In this video my paint is actually dried, but this is what I was using now to begin the painting of the outline. So my image was set up on a monitor beside me, and I drew this outline freely using a small Kolinsky sable brush, using the same mixture as I'd prepared the panel background with. In a few places I put in some indications of darker shapes, but for the moment I'm really just concentrating on getting the drawing correct. I was trying to film this with my paintbrush in one hand and my phone camera in the other hand, so anyway, here's the final outline drawing, and now I'm ready to begin painting. So I start with the background. I decided to do that first so that I could judge other values more clearly, and it also had the rather pleasing advantage of making the subject stand out straight away at an early stage in the painting. Here I'm using flake white with a little cadmium yellow pale and a touch of cobalt blue for the background. Next I place in the main dark forms as well as large blocks of simplified color shapes, which I'd already painted in my outline drawing. So when the main forms are all done, I begin to work on building up the texture and subtleties and slight temperature and color and value changes in different parts of the portrait. And for this I'm using my very small Isabey Kolinsky sable brush again, in a manner similar to that which I use when I'm painting an egg tempera. This is a wonderful brush because it holds quite a lot of paint, and as you can see here I'm working for quite a while just putting in these tiny touches. It looks like almost nothing is happening, but it makes these wonderful subtle adjustments. I'm sorry this is slightly out of shot. Here I'm adjusting this dark shape underneath the headphones, and I'm adding a little bit of lighter color to change the shape of the shadow. And so the whole painting proceeds in little touches like this. I'm working back and forward. I move across different parts of the painting, some opaque, some transparent, some warm, some cool. And my strokes are really cross hatches, and so the color oscillates and scintillates through these different touches. I painted the dreadlocks with a wonderful Michael Harding color called Vine Black, which is really a dark charcoal grey, but it wasn't quite dark enough in the shadow, so here I'm adding some of the darker darks around the edges of individual dreadlocks with ivory black to improve the sense of the form. As the focus in this portrait is on the profile and its striking form, I just suggested the shirt and jacket with much looser strokes and let the original imprimatura show through. So here then is the completed portrait, Dreadbeat. Thank you for joining me on this visit to Florence, and I'm painting a fascinating subject I met there. Happy painting.